A Soldier's Account. Narrated by Senior Sergeant Viktor Petrov, 57th Infantry Division. You want to know about heroes? Real heroes? Let me tell you about the summer of 1939, when I stood shoulder to shoulder with a man who would change the course of history. My name is Viktor Petrov, and I was there on the Mongolian steppe when Georgy Zhukov taught the Japanese Empire a lesson they would never forget. I was 23 years old then, a young sergeant in the Red Army, stationed in that godforsaken stretch of land where Mongolia meets Manchuria. The locals called it Khalkhin Gol, after the river that cut through the grasslands like a silver knife. We called it hell. The Japanese had been pushing into Soviet territory for months, testing our resolve, probing our defenses. Their Kwantung army was legendary, battle-hardened, ruthless, convinced of their own invincibility. They'd carved through China like a hot blade through butter, and now they wanted a piece of us. I'll never forget the day Zhukov arrived at our position. It was early June, and the dust was already choking us, the sun beating down like a hammer on an anvil. We were demoralized, scattered, taking casualties daily. Our previous commanders had been cautious, defensive, always reacting to Japanese moves instead of making our own. Then this man stepped out of a staff car. He wasn't particularly tall, maybe 5'7", with a square jaw and eyes that could drill through armor plate. General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. He was only 42, but he carried himself like he'd already fought 100 wars. There was something about him, an absolute certainty, a fierce determination that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. The first thing he did? He walked the lines. Not behind them, not observing from some safe distance, he walked right up to the front, where bullets were still snapping overhead, where you could smell the cordite and blood in the air. He looked every man in the eye, asked us about our positions, our ammunition, our morale. "Comrades," he said to my unit that first evening, his voice rough but clear, "the Japanese think we're afraid of them. They think they can push us around like they pushed the Chinese. They're wrong. This land is ours. These borders are ours. And we're going to make them understand that in a language they can't misinterpret." You could feel something shift in the men around me. Hope, maybe. Or just the recognition that someone finally gave a damn about winning. Zhukov didn't waste time. Within days, he'd reorganized our entire defensive structure. He brought in reinforcements, tanks, artillery, aircraft. But more than that, he brought a plan. A real plan. Not just to defend, but to strike back. To hit the Japanese so hard they'd never think about crossing into Soviet territory again. I remember the night of July 2nd. The Japanese launched one of their biggest assaults yet, trying to cross the Khalkhin Gol River in force. Thousands of them, supported by tanks and artillery, screaming those war cries that were supposed to freeze our blood. Zhukov was everywhere that night. I swear, the man didn't sleep. He moved from position to position, directing fire, repositioning units, plugging gaps in our lines before they could even form. I saw him personally lead a counterattack when a Japanese unit broke through near Hill 731. No hesitation. Just grabbed a rifle and charged forward with the men. We threw them back. Every last one of them. The river ran red that night, and it wasn't with Soviet blood. But Zhukov knew, and he made sure we knew, that defense wasn't enough. We don't just stop them, he told us during a briefing a few weeks later. We destroy them. Completely. So thoroughly that Tokyo will think twice before they test us again. He was planning something big. We could all feel it. The man was a tactical genius, you understand. He studied the Japanese, learned their tactics, their weaknesses. They were brave, disciplined, fanatical even. But they were predictable. They relied on infantry charges, on Bushido spirit, on the belief that willpower could overcome firepower. Zhukov knew better. He began assembling a massive force in secret, 3 infantry divisions, hundreds of tanks, armored cars, aircraft. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. They thought we were still just holding the line, playing defense. They had no concept of the hammer that was about to fall on them. I was assigned to a reconnaissance unit during this period, so I got to see Zhukov's planning up close. The man barely slept. He'd be up at dawn, reviewing maps, interrogating prisoners, flying reconnaissance missions himself. Yes, himself. I saw him climb into an aircraft more than once to get a personal look at Japanese positions. Know your enemy better than he knows himself, he told me once when I was delivering a report. Then use his own strength against him. The offensive began on August 20, 1939. I'll remember that morning until the day I die. The sun was just breaking over the steppe, painting the grasslands gold. And then the earth itself seemed to explode. Zhukov had positioned hundreds of artillery pieces in a massive arc around the Japanese positions. At precisely 5:45 a.m., they all opened fire at once. The sound was indescribable, like the end of the world, like God himself was tearing the sky apart. The ground shook. The air became one continuous thunder. For 3 hours, we pounded them. 3 hours of non-stop shelling. When the barrage finally lifted, the Japanese positions looked like the surface of the moon, nothing but craters and smoke and shattered equipment. Then came the tanks. Zhukov had assembled over 500 armored vehicles, BT-5s and BT-7s, some of the newest T-20s. They rolled forward in massive formations, flanking the Japanese on both sides. This was the first time anyone had used armor on such a scale in this theater. The Japanese had no answer for it. Their anti-tank guns were positioned to defend against frontal assault. Zhukov hit them from the sides and rear. Classic encirclement. A pincer movement that would have made Hannibal proud. I was in one of the infantry units that followed behind the armor. What I saw that day. The Japanese fought bravely, I'll give them that. They fought to the last man in many positions. But bravery means nothing when you're surrounded, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. Zhukov had trapped 3 entire Japanese divisions. Nearly 60,000 men, cut off, surrounded, with no hope of relief or escape. But here's what I remember most about Zhukov during those days, his absolute focus. No celebration, no gloating. Just constant pressure. He drove us forward relentlessly, tightening the noose, giving the enemy no time to regroup, no chance to establish new defensive lines. I saw him at the forward command post on August 23. An aide brought him news that we'd destroyed a major Japanese artillery position. Zhukov just nodded and pointed to the map. Good. Now take this position here. And this one. Keep moving. For 11 days, we ground them down. The Japanese kept fighting, some units tried to break out, others dug in and resisted to the death. But Zhukov had them in a vice, and he just kept squeezing. I was part of a unit that overran a Japanese field hospital on August 27. The wounded soldiers there, they looked at us with this expression I'll never forget, not hatred, not fear, but shock. Pure shock. They couldn't believe they'd been beaten so completely. The mighty Kwantung army, crushed by the Soviets they'd thought were weak and disorganized. By August 31, it was over. The Japanese had lost nearly 45,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. We'd lost about 17,000, which was heavy, but nothing compared to what they'd suffered. More importantly, we'd destroyed their offensive capability. We'd proven that the Red Army could not only defend Soviet territory but could strike back with devastating force. The Japanese signed a ceasefire within days. They never seriously threatened Soviet territory again. When World War II came, they looked south and east, toward the Pacific, toward America. They wanted no part of fighting Zhukov's armies. I saw Zhukov the day after the ceasefire was announced. He was walking through the field hospital, visiting the wounded. He stopped at every bed, every man. Thanked them personally for their service. There was this young private, couldn't have been more than 19, who'd lost a leg. Zhukov sat with him for 10 minutes, talking to him quietly, making sure he knew he was a hero. That's the thing about Zhukov that the history books don't always capture. Yes, he was a brilliant strategist, a tactical genius, ruthless in combat. But he genuinely cared about his soldiers. He knew that every tactical decision he made meant some of us wouldn't be coming home. And he took that responsibility seriously. Later that night, I was on guard duty near the command post. I could see Zhukov through the window, still working, still planning. It was past midnight. The man had just won one of the greatest victories in Soviet military history, and he was already thinking about the next challenge. A few of us were talking quietly, and someone asked, "Who is this man? Where did he come from?" I'd heard some of the stories. Zhukov grew up poor, son of a shoemaker in a little village. He'd been conscripted into the Tsar's army during World War I, served in the cavalry, earned the St. George's Cross for bravery. When the revolution came, he joined the Red Army and fought through the Civil War. He'd risen through the ranks not because of connections or politics, but because he was simply better than everyone else. He'd spent years studying warfare, reading every military text he could find, analyzing every battle in history. He understood logistics, tactics, strategy. But more than that, he understood people. How to motivate them, how to lead them, how to get them to achieve things they didn't think possible. He's the kind of man, I said to my comrades that night, who changes the course of history. I didn't know how right I was. Khalkhin Gol was just the beginning for Zhukov. 2 years later, when the Nazis invaded our homeland, he would be there again. Defending Moscow when the Germans were at the gates. Leading the counteroffensive that saved the capital. Planning the encirclement at Stalingrad that broke the Wehrmacht's back. Lifting the siege of Leningrad. Crushing Army Group Center in Operation Bagration. And finally, leading the assault on Berlin itself, planting the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. But I knew him first at Khalkhin Gol. I saw him when he was still building his legend, still proving what he could do. And I saw the qualities that would make him the man who saved our nation. Courage. Intelligence. Determination. And above all, an absolute refusal to accept defeat. There's a moment I think about sometimes. It was during the height of the battle, maybe August 24th or 25th. We'd been fighting for days straight, barely sleeping, eating on the move. Everyone was exhausted. The Japanese were resisting fiercely, and casualties were mounting. I saw some men in my unit starting to hesitate, starting to wonder if we could actually finish this. If the cost was too high. Zhukov appeared, as if he could sense the wavering. He gathered us together, maybe 30 or 40 soldiers, grimy, exhausted, some wounded but still fighting. "Comrades," he said, "I know you're tired. I know this is hard. But look around you. Look at the men beside you. You've already done something extraordinary. You've faced one of the most formidable armies in the world, and you've beaten them. Every step forward we take, every position we capture, we're not just defending our borders. We're defending our families, our homes, our future. The Japanese came here thinking they could take what's ours. We're teaching them they were wrong. And we're going to keep teaching them until they never forget." He paused, looked each of us in the eye. "I will never ask you to do something I wouldn't do myself. I will never waste your lives. But I will ask you to be brave for a little while longer. To push forward when you think you can't. Because I know, that together, we're unstoppable. And tomorrow, when this is over, you'll tell your children and grandchildren that you were here. That you stood with the Red Army at Khalkhin Gol. That you changed history. We didn't just fight for Zhukov after that speech. We'd have marched into hell for him. That was his gift. He made you believe. Not in propaganda, not in slogans, but in yourself. In your comrades. In the idea that ordinary men, when properly led and properly prepared, could achieve extraordinary things. The Japanese learned that the hard way. They came to Khalkhin Gol thinking it would be another easy victory, another step in their expansion. They found Georgy Zhukov instead. And they learned that some men, some armies, cannot be intimidated or defeated. They can only be killed, and even that comes at a terrible price. After Khalkhin Gol, Zhukov was promoted to general of the army. He was given command of the Kiev military district, then brought to Moscow to serve as chief of the general staff. When the Great Patriotic War began in 1941, Stalin turned to Zhukov again and again to save the situation. Leningrad, Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, Belarus, Poland, Berlin. He never lost a major battle. Not one. Think about that. In a war that consumed millions of lives, that devastated the largest country on earth, Georgy Zhukov never suffered a strategic defeat. Some called him harsh. Ruthless, even. It's true that he demanded everything from his men, that he pushed us to, and sometimes beyond, our limits. He wasn't interested in being liked. He was interested in winning, in saving the motherland, in destroying the enemies who threatened our existence. But harsh? Maybe. Ruthless with the enemy? Absolutely. But with his own men? He was the commander who made sure we had the ammunition, the support, the intelligence we needed. Who didn't throw away lives in pointless assaults. Who actually had a plan and the skill to execute it. I served under other commanders during the war. Some were brave, some were competent. None of them were Zhukov. When you served under Zhukov, you knew three things: the mission would be difficult, the standards would be high, and you would win. I'm an old man now. It's been more than 80 years since that summer on the Mongolian steppe. Most of the men I served with are gone. Zhukov himself passed in 1974, just a few months short of his 78th birthday. He lived to see the Soviet Union become a superpower, to see the nation he'd helped save become one of the two poles of the world order. But I still remember him as he was at Khalkhin Gol. Young, well, younger. Energetic. Hungry to prove himself on the world stage. Absolutely certain that he could beat the Japanese if given the chance. And he did. God, how he did. People talk about great generals. Napoleon. Alexander. Hannibal. Caesar. I tell you, Georgy Zhukov belongs in that company. I saw him take a nearly defeated army and turn it into a victorious one through sheer force of will and brilliant tactics. I saw him encircle and destroy an enemy that had never known defeat. I saw him change the strategic situation in Asia with one battle. And I saw him care about the men who fought for him. That's what people forget. The great general wasn't just a master of tactics. He was a leader of men. He made us believe we could win, and then he showed us how. When people ask me about heroes, about courage, about what it means to serve your country, I tell them about Khalkhin Gol. About the summer of 1939, when a Soviet general with everything to prove taught the Japanese Empire that they'd picked the wrong enemy. When Georgy Zhukov showed the world what the Red Army could do with proper leadership. I tell them about the man who saved us at the Khalkhin Gol River, who would go on to save Moscow, Leningrad, and ultimately, our entire nation. The man who stood between the motherland and her enemies, again and again, and never once stepped back. I tell them about the Iron Marshal. About Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. And I tell them I was proud, so proud, to serve under his command. That's my story. That's my truth. I was there. I saw it all. And I'll go to my grave knowing that once, in the summer of my youth, I served alongside the greatest military commander of the 20th century. We were young. We were scared. We were outnumbered and fighting an enemy that thought it couldn't lose. But we had Zhukov. And that made all the difference. This story is based on the historical Battle of Khalkhin Gol, Namenhan incident, fought between Soviet-Mongolian forces and Japan in 1939. Georgy Zhukov's decisive victory at this battle established him as one of the Soviet Union's most capable commanders and would prove crucial in World War II.